What an exciting opportunity to make it all about me. Like, it wasn't good enough to have an hour-long class before this, right? You had to get more of me. And no, seriously, I just want to thank, of course, all the organizers, Campus Ministry, Social Action, where everything good happens, to organize these. Agape Cafes are really kind of legendary. They were started, as you all know, in Boston College, which happens to be where I did my PhD, long before they started the Agape Cafes. But anyway, there's a bit of a lineage there, and it's really hard to take the time to think about yourself. In plain English, it's kind of an odd feeling. So when I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? Migration, right? And no, not exactly, more like you. And so we went around, and finally I said, okay, I'm going to think about me. And that's what I did this weekend. I thought about me. It was a challenge. But so it's not just about me, of course. It's about who we are and how we relate to each other, people, faith, the role of our belief system, and how we kind of do what we do with a passion, I think is the way I like to think about it. And I am fairly passionate in what I do in my professional work. I like to think in other things too. But I think that when I wrote this out, I said, I know I don't want to read it. I'm not going to read it. I promise not to read it. But I will have to refer to it kind of to keep me, keep the thread going. So the first, I guess, quick thing I'd like to talk about, because it's a big subject and not on the agenda for this evening, is God. God is, of course, something and somebody and someone or something or some spiritual force that we see in many different things. Some people see it in art. Some people see it in the detail of a tremendous painting. Some people see it in the food they eat, the world we live in, the sun, the moon, the stars, and you name it. And we all see something like it somewhere. And in my world, I think, if I reflect on where I see God in other people. And I not just people in general, not in the abstract sense, but I see God in social movements, to put it in a sociological term. I see God in mobilization. I see God in people that really stop what they're doing, their ordinary affairs, and start to say, we need to change this. This is intolerable. This is not the way it should be. And to me, that becomes the expression of spirituality, and it's what I think about, not only in a spiritual sense as the things that kind of awe me and inspire me, but also in terms of my work, of course. And so I think about, what would I be if I was something different? And thinking of this hurricane season, I'd say I would probably be a storm chaser, because I really just kind of like to run behind to where the action is and see what it looks like on the inside, of course, without getting stepped on, which is what storm chasers do. They keep just enough distance not to get trampled, but they sort of see, like, what's the velocity look like of this kind of whirling social storm. And if I could just reflect on sociology as a discipline, for those of you not familiar with it, the discipline arose fairly recently in the course of history. I promised not to do a PowerPoint. In fact, you'll see they wouldn't give me the opportunity. They saw me starting to work on my laptop. That sociology arose in a dialogue with the role of religion in a very expansive way. For example, what holds society together? And Neil Durkheim came to a conclusion that it was religion that binds us together into larger communities. If we looked at, let's say, the work of Karl Marx, religion can also be things that obscure things, that can be kind of manipulated. It can be an opium of the masses, if you will, in that kind of famous Marxian formula. Which has been influential in sociological thinking in a kind of a critical way. Maybe looking at formal discourses, looking at corruption in religious institutions, and looking when things aren't always happy, and when crimes take place within the shroud of secrecy of religion. And so there's that room for that critical view in sociology, and we have people like Max Weber, just to argue a third, that was one of the founders of a way of thinking that said, well, maybe our world has become the world that it is because of the sort of mobilizing force of religion to get people acting in particular kinds of ways. And to me, that was kind of influential, I think, in my own professional dialogue that got me interested in sociology, because people oftentimes ask me, well, why did you major in that anyway? And I majored in sociology when I came in I wasn't an undecided person. I actually went for the sociology, and I stayed with it and kept with it, and there's probably a reason for that, and I'll try to reflect on that briefly. So it all starts with your family, of course, right? I grew up in a family with an unshakably Catholic mother, and a very dedicated mother, and a wonderful person, and a Protestant father who was largely agnostic, had pretty much, gotten away from the religious ritual of the church in the Presbyterian kind of fashion, but nevertheless had this kind of very strong ethic about work. It's kind of legendary for the Protestant ethic, right? The Protestant work ethic. My father was a working Protestant. He was a walking Protestant work ethic. I mean, it's all he kind of revolved around, and much to the chagrin of my mother, there's a lot of friction there. Of course, you can imagine you have a Catholic mom and a Protestant dad, and you're asking for it. So, just turn on the news. Oh boy, there's Northern Ireland. Here we go. So, I just want to reflect though on that. There is that course that you grow up, and small things can be big things. They sort of affect your development later on in the family setting. I'm sure you all are aware of this, and you've felt it. And I think of a story I've heard a lot of my parents talk about, and that was that. Being that there was an interfaith marriage in 1948, it wasn't a slam dunk automatic thing that you could get married in the church as a Catholic woman in Darby, Pennsylvania. And so you had to sort of, ask permission, was this going to work? And well, the priest met with the couple and with my maternal grandfather present, very devout Catholic on the maternal side. And they had long discussions, and how do you feel about, and no question about, my father wasn't about to convert to Catholicism, and my mother wasn't being asked to convert to anything. So we had this kind of issue about the wedding, and the priest said, well, how do you feel about educating the future children? Of course, it's just assuming that there's going to be children. And it was in 1948, and it was a good assumption. There were 3 of them later. And sure, so what was the upshot? Dad said, yeah, okay, you can raise them Catholic, Mom, but Dad, want them to go to public school. It's just sort of like paid for it, paid my taxes, want them to go to public school. I'm a truck driver, and I work hard, pay taxes, and there it is. So that was the deal, but that wasn't good enough. So the priest said, you can't get married in the church, you have to get married in the entrance to the church, which last I heard is not the same thing as the church. So they got married in the entrance of the church that my mom grew up with around, and that was kind of the beginning of sort of fortunately my grandfather stood by this agreement saying it was sufficiently sacred enough to be, kind of acceptable. But it was that kind of static that starts, the kind of work on you early on. And my father, again, was a hard worker, and one of the things he was open to was letting his sons work with him. He worked in a refinery earlier on in life, narrowly escaped explosions several times, and that was after narrowly escaping death in World War II. So he was a lucky guy, I guess. Probably came closest to getting killed in a car accident later, but as a truck driver, it offered the opportunity where we as children could go along and jump on the truck and go around with the deliveries, as he's a local delivery guy around the Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area, mostly Philadelphia. And so my brother, of course, being 7 years older, I'm the last of the 3, was first. And then as I got older, I started about the age of 6. I just couldn't wait to be with Dad on the truck, right? This was like big people's world. And next thing I knew, every Saturday of my childhood went to working on the truck, which was semi-voluntary as it got older. It was, nowadays we'll probably break international conventions on, child labor. But to me, it really shaped who I am. I mean, it was the adult world with all its kind of vulgar, violent, and nastiest, strikes and all that stuff. Making delivery at Westinghouse. Oh my God, there's a picket line. What are we going to do today? That sort of stuff. But it was a vision of a world that maybe you could say I missed out on childhood since I never played any athletic sports or Saturday activities. But I saw another world. It was the world of work and the world of sometimes mobilized work. And so I think that kind of probably definitely kind of shaped my worldview. I mean, Dad is an agnostic. He's like, there might be a God, but I'm not so sure about that. But, let's work, and gotta get that delivery on time. And it's all kind of there in the values of your calling, I guess. That was the great, Lutheran, Protestant contribution to humanity, was to dignify work and all of its activity. And I think that's really where my father got it from, for sure. There's no other explanation of waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and waiting until 6 p.m. That's like a college professor. I mean, geez, that's as bad as it gets. So I do remember, however, about the age of 13, a rather monumental point, because we were raised Catholic, and I was sitting in church, and I listened to the homily. And the homily said the following. It said, I'm 13 years old. The priest was basically, just in plain English, passionately calling for us to, passionately support our president, that was Nixon at the time, for his, dedication to our country and to, that he's working hard for peace. And this was, just months after Kent State massacre of, troops opening fire, and plenty of evidence that the White House was saying, yeah, take these demonstrations down. It was 13 years old, but my brother was involved in anti-war demonstrations here in Long Island. I mean, the LIU, and there was already a consciousness going around this period of time. It was the time and the place, and I just remember the context was unmistakable. This was a completely uncritical reading of a very, very problematic situation of of a war that had turned genocidal, and here it seemed to me like it was getting a blessing. I remember how much it took to tell my mother that that's the last Catholic Mass I will ever attend. And that was the last Catholic Mass I ever attended as a practicing Catholic. That had a big impact on me, and it sort of shapes the way you're at. But anyway, so it wasn't a complete disconnection, as you can probably guess from the punchline, right? So it wasn't a complete disconnection. That sounded Trumpish. Let's see. Other high school experiences, I'll just got to bypass because I can see the time's going to go really quick. So let me go to college, because I did know I wanted to be a sociology major. It was kind of related to this critical anti-war movement style environment of again, the 1970s. And what I discovered at Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is where I opted for, a public state college, that was partly maybe my worldview at that time, partly finances is probably, just the affordable option at that time. And at Westchester State College, there were, active things going on at the time. The war is beginning to wind down, it's still puddling along, but the war protest had pretty much kind of wound down by 1974. It was almost an agreement, maybe not almost, and then 75 it would come to a kind of an end, kind of an inglorious end. There were activists on campus that were boycotting lettuce. I said, that's interesting. Lettuce boycott, and boycotting grapes, and boycotting Gallo wine, which was not a big loss for some of us. But the bottom line is that there was a lot of activism. And where do you think that activism was centered? But the Newman Center, right? The Newman Center, that Catholic presence in many public institutions, where the Catholic action message gets carried forward in kind of an autonomous space under the rubric as part of the larger college or university. And this particular kind of activism was a civil rights struggle. I mean, Cesar Chavez came to visit once to give a talk. It's not just a kind of a solidarity, abstract kind of process, but that if you know anything about Westchester, Pennsylvania, it's very close to Kennett Square, which is like the US capital of mushroom growing, which is about as close as any of us ever get, unless there are Catholic action people that start bringing you out to say, there's real human beings working here, and they speak Spanish, and maybe they don't have papers on them. And this is a long part of a longer story of, immigrant labor in this country and how our system kind of depends on immigrant labor. And so what we had was a very, I think, dynamic action on campus, unmistakably inspired by Catholic thinkers and Catholic activists. As a result of those communities, I would come into contact with some rather very interesting additional Catholic activists, like the Berrigans, who came to town, and they got involved with some of their nonviolent actions. You may recall that the Berrigan brothers were very famous for their activities, not least of which was in King of Prussia, not all that far from where I was studying. They went into a military facility and hammered, missile cones into reentry systems into plowshares. And that was a very famous kind of, if you will, radical statement, which to me sounded to me like awfully brave people. I mean, these were very principled people, and as a result, I began to get involved with some of their nonviolent protests. That took me to places like the Pentagon. Elizabeth McAllister, I remember, was leading one of the groups that I was with, and we went to various kinds of activist events that were basically opposing either nuclear arms proliferation or, again, related to the idea of peacemaking. And that was pretty much I was working, of course, because my father, I'm working the entire time, full-time when I was in college. So I worked in the cafeteria as a full-time, my senior year was a full-time supervisor of the cleaning crew. So we come on the action when everybody else has kind of gone away and clean up the mess, and we get done by about 3 in the morning, and we kind of wonder how we're getting up for class the next day. But, it's life and full-time work. I know many of you know the story. Whether you're working or you work in the summers, you know that you've got to kind of work somewhere along the line to make it all fit together. So I went on to graduate school at the University of Maryland down the road. It's not very far. One of my professors, I had great professors at Westchester. Of course, you know that professors can be very influential in your life, and I try to be sometimes that person because that's the way I got into this circuit. I had a great Mennonite professor at Westchester who was a peace pacifist activist. He happened to have been harassed by the FBI. That kind of sharpened my senses about, wow, you can really just ask, you could just be a kind of a harmless fly on the wall, and the FBI was worried in certain periods of time. And as a result, I kind of got a lot of sensibilities about technological issues. He happened to teach math and computer science, and it was very interesting. He thought that the technology of remote warfare would probably give rise to untold genocide in future generations, and he was a bit concerned about that, and I guess so was the FBI. But in any case, when I got to the University of Maryland, I have to say that I was a little less impressed with the professors. I mean, there were some interesting professors, but many of them were working on the Pentagon payroll at the University of Maryland. So the University of Maryland, politically speaking, for me, was kind of like you do your politics over here, and then you do your graduate work over there. Because the graduate students were great. About half of my fellow graduate students were from Iran. They were actively protesting the Shah of Iran at the time, very despotic dictator. They had a terrible secret police that was hunting them down even in the States. And so they were in a very interesting situation, and they were revolutionaries. They were engaging in activism, trying to bring down this despotic. And when it finally happened in '79, most of them went home. And most of them are probably dead now because they probably fell on the wrong side of how things rolled out in the ensuing years. As Iran took a kind of a wild turn from its initial turn, and many Iranians are now living in this country that were active in that revolutionary movement. But one of the things I did get active in that period of time of living in Washington, of course, was all these political activities. And one of the things I got active in was the solidarity with Central America. At the time, there was a big movement against, for kind of a people's insurrection taking place in Nicaragua. 1978 is when I started my graduate career. So we're talking like 1978 is a year before what would become the Sandinista Revolution of '79. So we were pretty active in kind of doing solidarity work and looking at the horrific, the murder on ABC National News of Bill Stewart, a press reporter for ABC who was well known, somebody you'd recognize like Wolf Blitzer, is sitting there in Managua during the remaining days of the Somoza dictatorship, and the soldiers come up, the National Guard come up and blew him away on national TV, and that's what led President Carter to cut aid to Nicaragua, to the Somoza dictatorship. Took a little while, but he finally caught on, and human rights and all that stuff that the Carter administration was talking about, and we were involved with that, and we also started hearing a lot about El Salvador, where a lot of violence was taking place, and I remember very distinctly the revolution in 1979 in Nicaragua. I remember in 1980 to an event live where we saw Archbishop Romero giving a talk in El Salvador. They were live feeding it into Washington at this event. And I was just like, wow, listen to this guy. I can't believe this. This is an archbishop talking, commanding people in the name of God to stop firing on civilians. And I said, yeah, that's right. That's like, wow, is that powerful? And of course, to find that the guy's assassinated 3 days later, right, while the saying Mass. Again, commanding people in the name of God not to fire on your own people. So that was probably a kind of like a straw that kind of pushed me over a little bit, another of a hump, and I started to get more involved with activism around Central American solidarity. And we began to have meetings about forming a nationwide, kind of in the Vietnam spirit of things, anti-Vietnam War era, sort of a national association for solidarity with El Salvador. It would later be called CISPES. I was one of those founders, and in fact, what I agreed to do was go to Boston and start a Boston chapter, because I decided to go to Boston to study in graduate school. So I took the charge of going to Boston and just sort of single-handedly starting the CISC-based chapter of Boston, which actually turned out to be one of the biggest ones in the country. I met fantastic people along the way. I met people like Noam Chomsky, Martin Diskin, and people in Mobilization for Survival. There was a whole kind of a machinery already there in Boston. And when we started having meetings and you start to see these kind of people just roll into action, yeah, there was a history accumulated from the anti-war movement that was still alive and kind of ready to kind of swing into action. So we began to, of course, unspeakable horrors would take place day after day. With the December 1980, the murders of the two Maryknoll nuns and the two lay missionaries. We would have massacres, of course, of nameless people that would make less news, but happened rather constantly. We were really kind of thinking how to mobilize an end. Maybe the Congress could legislate an end to financing this military junta, in El Salvador, and doing so by proxies and everything else. So we had a big kind of chore. We began to, I remember our first demonstration had 4 people at it, was Vice President Mondale was coming to town, right? And then, of course, that will all change with the election of Ronald Reagan. Things will kind of really get into a kind of a hyper pitch, and we'd start to get more people coming to our demonstrations. I remember one demonstration outside of the Boston Federal Building where this guy taps me on the shoulder as I'm handing out leaflets. I turn around and there's Senator Edward Kennedy, says, "Can I have one of your leaflets?" And I'm like, "Sure, why not?" I'm like, "I know this guy, I've seen this guy somewhere before. He's got an Irish accent." And he said, "Yes, this is really good. You people are doing a great job. Just, I am co-sponsoring legislation to cut off the aid, and you guys got to make more noise than this if we're going to change things." And struts off in typical Kennedy style, But this is Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is again, kind of an active period. And for me, it was sort of okay. I'm seeing it on this end. I'd kind of like to see it on the other end. Interestingly enough, I hadn't been to Latin America ever in my life. The first time I go to Latin America, wouldn't you know it, is Cuba in 1980. Now, how do I get to Cuba? Well, Boston College has a graduate school of social work. And the School of Social Work has a study abroad in Cuba in 1980. Now, that's a little bit ahead of us, I have to say. And so we've got one, but not 1980. And this is, we had a Greek professor of social work who was a well-known city planner, and he had this kind of history of traveling around Eastern Europe. This is still the Soviet times, right? And this is Cuba under the period of the Cold War. And, we went and we really kind of saw an alternative view of how social work can be organized and how social services can be delivered, and it was a rather fascinating experience. We came back with a kind of it's nothing like I thought it was. It's really a lot different. And for me, wait, where are the police? They're in every corner, right? I remember asking a Cuban, where are the police? That's what I'd like to know. Where are the police? There's nobody directing traffic out here. So, you kind of get your stereotypes quickly breaking down when you see a different society that you've always heard about, but you've heard it filtered through these news outlets that, of course, are now filtering big time, even if they happen to be filtering for the moment against our president, which is a well-deserved filter. You just have to realize that these are the same people that also filter in the opposite direction. So just beware, of the way they construct their stories. I think you know that, but I just wanted to make that noise. So in 1982, I began, as a result of the Cuba trip, interestingly enough, one of the people on the trip is a social worker, says, we need somebody to work in this child abuse. We've got these after hours, and I started interning in social services. And a year later, I am a full-time social worker working in the Department of Social Services in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where, as you heard, I worked for 4 years in child protective screening, which means you'd get those calls after the 5 o'clock bell rings and the social workers go home, and before the 9 o'clock bell rings in the morning, where you can call somebody. We're the people you call if you're having a problem. And we've got to use our skills, and of course that's you get a master's degree to have it, so fortunately I already had one of those from the University of Maryland. It was good enough in sociology, didn't have to be an MSW, that's probably changed. But in any case, I had enough skills to say when I hear a young guy calling up saying, I've got this issue, my uncle keeps playing this game and he puts a lobster on my back, and I'm like, lobster? Lobster on your back? Can you say more? Yeah, it really is lobster. And you got to get, you've got to get used to hear child speak for what passes for what, of course, is sexual abuse. And you've got to make a call about whether you send the police out there right then and there, or whether you think this is something that's been ongoing for 7 years, in which case you can probably wait till Monday, 9 o'clock, when a calmer operation can take place. And that was the kind of, well, let's just call it the seamy side of capitalism. That's what I like to call it. It was kind of like the underside of the awful things that go wrong in families. And you know, people tell me about the instincts and the maternal instincts, and I'm saying, well, why is this mother burning the living daylights out of her child with cigarettes? What could cause that? You know, so as a sociologist, of course, it was like, shall we say, never-ending stuff to work with. But I did kind of realize about in year 4, as I'm doing a PhD at the same time in sociology, that I'm going to have to make a decision here. And I did realize at one point that I was teaching part-time at the same time, Framingham State College, and students would say, Professor, why are you so angry? You come in kind of angry sometimes. I've been working the night before, and I'm hearing about sexual abuse going on of the trusted caretaker of my dear uncle, who's not really my uncle, but we call him uncle. And I'm like, God, you know, it kind of just comes out in the classroom. And so if I sound angry sometimes in class, it's because something kind of maybe earlier on kind of inspired me to think that way and kind of critically about stuff that you know is evil. But you've got to somehow figure out a way to rationally confront the issue and maybe try to put some kind of, you know, play your role, your 2 cents in that. And I found my role was better served working in a school of nursing at the time in Framingham, teaching about social problems rather than perhaps continuing on in practice. And so I got away from social work. And in 1985, I took a better offer, happened to be from a former girlfriend. And the offer was to travel across the country in her brand new van, it doesn't get any better than that, to examine her doctoral dissertation work, which I'm also working at the same time about Central America. I chose Nicaragua as my case study, and I was looking at development. She was studying the new sanctuary movement at the time of 1985. It's really the old sanctuary movement for you folks. And that is where churches were taking in people, refugees that were fleeing the violence of Central America and facing deportation back to probably nearly certain death, or certainly not a happy ending. And that was her study, her topic, and I was her facilitator. And of course, that just kind of went hand in hand and worked well, right? So we went from Atlanta all the way across Texas, down, this is all on the wheels, you know, the wheels. And we went to Los Angeles and Tucson and all of the hot spots of the sanctuary movement, and what was called at the time, thanks to a wonderful book by a very spiritual person by the name of Rennie Goldman, called The New Underground Railroad. And one of the things we discovered along the way was some of the old Underground Railroad of slavery was still there and part of the new Underground Railroad of refugees. And it was a really fascinating revelation to find that happening. But in any case, what we found was that unspeakable evil was taking place in their countries. Unfortunately, these were client states of the U.S. I'm talking about Guatemala and El Salvador. And of course, I had worked at El Salvador Sanctuary Solidarity work, so this was right on target for me. And this was like seeing the connection and the all glory, you know, of the evil of the connection. And it was a fantastic experience for sure. And I could tell stories about that, but then I won't get to my ending here in a long time. So, you know, the sanctuary movement, of course, is still with us. Our president is an opponent of sanctuary cities. Those sanctuary cities grew out of the original sanctuary movement. And all I can say is, you know, resist and demand for people's rights. I mean, that's our role. That's what we can do in our own place, in our own workplace, in our own school. We can play our part. This is, you know, part of people's mobilizing for survival. So anyway, life went on, and I moved on from I actually finished my PhD in 1986. My first job was at Colgate University. I did 1 year, and I said, I've had enough of the cows and the farms. I want a big city. So I started looking. It was a temporary job. It wasn't that I just walked away from it. I was filling in for somebody for a 1 year sabbatical. And so I was on the market, and I interviewed at places including Manhattan College in 1986. It's a secret. I never told anyone. They're not filming, are they? Oh, they are. So yeah, and I got the job offer. And I got a job offer from Dominican University in Chicago, the Cincinnati Dominicans. And I got a job offer from the University of Wisconsin. And I got all 3 on the same day. How weird is that? Nobody believes me. I got 3 calls the same day. And these were not good hiring times, folks. This was another recession. They're kind of cyclical. And this was like, the home stretch. And so I got to decide. And I had come to each place to interview, of course. And I, Manhattan College, and you know the story, right? The library looked a little different, a little smaller, a little bit down like with the original entrance. But otherwise, it was... nobody's there. Nobody's here from that period, hardly. I barely have connected. The president changed. The brother, scandal moved on, and he was just coming in after. So when I came back a few years later, nobody recognized me. I didn't recognize anybody, so we didn't talk about it. Just wasn't sure how that would go over, You offered the job, but you didn't take it, so are you the person for us now? But anyway, though, I did go to Chicago, and I was there for a better part of 16 years. And in Chicago, things really sort of, changed around. I was continuing my activities in Central America. I went to Central America a lot when I could. Well, Chicago brought me a new girlfriend also in 1993, who just happened to be a gorgeous Peruvian lawyer. And she's sitting right over here. She just happens by the coincidence to be in town here. And we put her to work, of course. She's a human rights advocate and also works at the United Nations. Right now in Switzerland, which creates a sort of a gap here, so we're very happy this week. And anyway, so she was at the time living in Bogota, Colombia. It was a visit to Chicago. So I was invited, did go down to Bogota, Colombia, and later went for a whole year sabbatical in 1996 and 1997. Was my first time of really being fully ingrained into the Colombian scene. It was very interesting. I gave talks in Medellin and places around the country that fascinated me. I remember giving a talk at the Department of Economics in Medellin. In the beginning of the year, I went back 3 years later, and I said, "Hey, where's so-and-so?" "Oh, you didn't hear?" And so, I found that half the people were either exiled or were dead because of the violence that were taking place in the capital, former home of Pablo Escobar. So it was Colombia was filled with activity, and for sure, I think certainly qualifies as a continuing storm. Although things are looking up lately with the disarmament of the guerrillas and a kind of a peace accord, which we're very happy about. Well, we did get married, and at that time, and we returned to Colombia later on when Gladys took a job at the United Nations as a gender advisor, and I took a year leave of absence to accompany her in her first year in Bogota, and then she was transferred to Panama, and somehow, don't ask me, I'm a lucky person, I managed to land a Fulbright in Panama, so the next year I was in Panama. And I was able to follow her, that's not even just a storm chaser now. Now I'm just chasing my wife. And that was really fascinating. Panama was right after the canal just got handed back. And so we were, just in a kind of an interesting situation. And she was working in human rights, traveling around a lot. And I was working with Panamanian professors, giving workshops and actually teaching classes with Panamanian students. And it was just absolutely thrilling to meet wonderful people. And then in 2003, she was transferred to Guatemala, and my Dominican university just kind of asked me, "Do you plan on ever coming back to work? Are you thinking about your position here at Dominican?" And I had to make a decision, of course, and you can sort of guess. So I resigned my tenure there and went to Guatemala. Not after one whole year of commuting, I commuted from Guatemala City to Chicago. There's a direct flight. It's 4 hours. I had diplomatic credentials as a result of her insertion, so I could just blow right through security. I could be there eating breakfast if I left 2 in the morning from Chicago. So it was a hefty commute. So don't ever talk about complaining about your commute. I'll tell you about that. And but ultimately, after a year of that, I think we've kind of called a shot. So I went back to Dominican for a whole year to participate in my own replacement on a mutual accord, and then eventually came back to Guatemala. And then shortly after, we moved to Argentina, where Gladys was the head of office of UNICEF. And I was working with study abroad, U.S. study abroad teams working in Argentina. And that all worked until Gladys got shifted back. Her transfer ultimately came back to the United Nations, home central here, where she was part of the foundation of UN Women, which is a major agency within the United Nations. She worked with former President Bachelet of Chile, who's now again president, I guess, on the way out. And So that was an interesting period of time, and oh yeah, I interviewed at Manhattan College. They just suddenly came up with, they were looking for a chairperson of sociology, and I said, hey, I'm your guy. No one recognizes me, so I won't tell you. You don't tell, no, don't talk, don't tell, whatever, you know. So I got the job, as you can see, and I've been here since 9 years, and it's been, of course, a wonderful experience. I know I'm probably running close on time. But I'll just say that since I've been here, we've chased a few storms. Gladys and I went to Mexico now 2 years ago after a rather horrendous massacre took place of students who were protesting cutbacks in universities. You heard of those things? And there was a terrible kind of massacre where a whole busload of students were intercepted by police. Now, to be fair, they intercepted a bus and were using it to carry themselves to a demonstration, but when they were detained by the police, they handed them over to the local drug mafia, and they all disappeared. And they've never been seen since. This created a mass movement in Mexico, throughout Mexico. In fact, when we went to Mexico, and sure enough, what's my topic? I went to Mexico to give a talk on student protests. And the students are all mobilized around this disappearance, this mass disappearance, which is still is only a couple months old at that point, now like 6 weeks to be precise old, but has been since never solved, and has not been adequately investigated. There was a lot of cover-ups. Apparently, the local mayor was just absolutely aghast that they were going to be protesting, and he just, thought it was cool to hand these students over. That'll teach them a lesson, and they all disappeared. That remains to be. Of course, he went fleeing out of the area. The mayor left town, worried about him ending up in jail, of course, where he belongs. And there it was, a horrific massacre. So I remember in that climate of fear, talking about this, and I said, and this got me in the newspapers the next morning, I mean, God, the least the government can do is, protect people's lives if they're protesting. I mean, even if they're arrested, protect their, it's the least they can do. And that was my headline, in the La Jornada the next day. So we were just kind of like looking behind us in dark alleys, because there were troops like in the town that we're talking in Zacatecas, Mexico. And it was just a kind of a tense scene. In fact, one of the journalists came up to me after the talk and he said, you know what? First of all, thank you for your talk. This is you, and he's talking him to me, right? And he's saying, we're all scared to talk. He said something like that in Spanish. Mm-hmm. And he said that you kind of have emboldened us a little bit, and I just wanted to thank you for that. And I said, yeah, it's easy for me. I'm getting on a plane in 2 days, and what about you? You've got to go home, and that's the problem in Mexico today. We've got a lot of, of disappearances, a lot of intimidation, and a lot of corruption, and a lot of cover-up, a lot of interest, and take my course, and you'll hear more about this in Latin America development. Okay, so anyway, to then just kind of wrap up, I am, as you know, scheduled to go to Rome in the spring for our study abroad semester. It's our pilot program, first time. And so I wanted to plug that fact. I mean, not that you're all going to jump into Rome, but I would like to sort of just let you know and spread the word that we think this is an important program, and we think it's part of LaSallian mission. And my role in this will be teaching a course having to do with the European crisis of migration. It will be going out and doing. This is not just sitting in the classroom like I torture people every Monday night, like the people here that came along with me. But we'll be actually going out and meeting people and activists and people that are actually on the ground confronting these waves of people coming from unspeakable conditions and a growing hostility on the part of Europeans to go back to where you came from. We don't want to see you. So you've got this kind of dynamic going. Don't get me wrong. Germany, Italy, they've been very receptive, but they just keep coming. It's a crisis, and there's no end in sight. So somehow, some way, we've got to come to grips with this, and we've got to create, social solutions. We've got to create, everybody doing their share, and that's not where I hear our country at right now. So I think we all have our work cut out for us. So thank you for this opportunity.
So much, Dr. Dello. That was great. We have a few minutes for any questions before we close out the night.
This question?
That's right. I have it right. Lucky I didn't read this one.
So I think, in my experience at Manhattan College, we definitely have a commitment to scholarship and academia, and we have a commitment to social justice. But that often like the two are very separate, and like working very hard separately and like doing great things separately, but that our Lasallian heritage would sort of suggest that like the two go hand in hand.
Yes.
So I guess I kind of wonder how your experiences have like shaped what you think of as the relationship between like activism and academia, and then also like what we can be doing as students at Manhattan to sort of like bridge that gap.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very important question, so thank you for it. And it's I would say a couple of things. First of all, that speaking as a sociologist briefly, the sociologist of religion, there's a kind of something built into Catholicism. There's a little bit of a separation between your sacred life and your secular life. And it's part of the sort of tradition of Catholicism. And forgive me, anybody who's a better expert on this, but I'm just speaking kind of at a distance. And as opposed to, let's say, some of the Protestantism that developed in the course of history to try to rectify some of that, to kind of, to re-spiritualize everyday life and bring it back into, your work and your calling and God's work, and the work is yours. So, Lasallian, beliefs and values, of course, are part of the Catholic tradition. There's many varieties of the Catholic tradition, and it just happens to be among the best ones. Of course, we all know that already. The fact that we're here, we kind of know this, right? And so it's kind of natural that we're sort of reinventing the connection, but the disconnection took place in kind of a historical way that's kind of bigger than any of us to really fully understand. It's a bit of a mystery there. But the reconnection is important. For me, it was kind of like a de facto reconnection by the presence of Catholic action people in a very secular environment was like a lifeline for me to reconnect with solidarity of people that I didn't even know were out there. All I know is it kind of smelled like a sewer on foggy days. I didn't know why. I didn't even know anything about it. I didn't know there were mushroom farms out there, let alone migrant workers working in them. So, organization, mobilization, movement. So join, affiliate, educate yourself, and find that there are alternative sources of information. These movements, mobilize peoples, create information. That information is important to hear. It may not always be 100%, let's say, like the figure wasn't exactly right, but they're telling you something that the media may not be telling you because they're selling soap opera, right? They're selling detergent, they're selling clothes. They're telling you they have a different mission. They're informing you a roundabout kind of way because they're selling cars or whatever. Right. So you've got this kind of contradiction of your sources. Education, therefore, in college means working with others other than just your professors, just with the official media. Say, I watch the news, I read the newspaper every day, I watch the news. Okay, that's a good start. So do I. And I watch it, I'm like, God, they're not even talking about it. What happened? Now, I have to say, Puerto Rico is a good example of, of interesting relationship the U.S. has with Puerto Rico, how the reaction to the storm was what it was, how the president's patting himself on the back, what a great job we're doing as the island is still basically preparing for a diaspora to evacuate the island. And in all that context, there's maybe an interesting moment where the press, because of their relationship to the president attacking them, is attacking back. It's a kind of interesting moment. We want to understand that dynamic, when it maybe applies or when it doesn't, and how we can maybe encourage the idea of looking for, alternative outlets. You people all are holding these devices in your hands that you know how to work them better than I do, right? And they're filled with information. So one of the things you're going to find are people are organizing around different issues, pick the issues that grab you, and go out and get involved with them. Classroom is where learning starts, right? College is where professional learning starts, and it's just an open-ended box. It goes on from there. So if you just stay in the classroom, you're really missing out on all the opportunities. That's why the Lasallian mission is so important, because we kind of integrated the thing from the get-go, and we move out from there, and that's, what makes it powerful.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Dello.